So now I'm going to talk about entity formation. So like bringing it back to the skit, I want to ask, what type of entity does Green Commonwealth want to form as, if any? So first I'll think about what a business entity is. A business entity is a legal structure, and so a business will choose an entity, and whichever entity they choose will determine the legal structure under which they operate. Some of the main considerations that have driven some of our clients to choose one entity over another are liability, tax treatment, and mission. So certain businesses would elect to form a limited liability company or limited liability entity rather, so that way they could protect the owners against certain lawsuits. And I'll discuss more about that later. Certain business entities prefer to pass the tax through the entity directly to the individuals who earn the money. And that I'll discuss more later as well, or that will be discussed more later. And certain business entities choose to embed certain social missions into the DNA of the business, ensuring the entity would be a social enterprise for forever, as opposed to just for a certain period of time, if at all. Not that you want to plan to be sued, but you want to plan for the event that it might happen. So what happens if I get sued? If there's no entity that's formed, then likely the green business would be a general partnership. But then, like I said before, some people or some entities, some groups choose limited liability. And so in the case of Green Commonwealth, if they don't elect to do anything at all, then they'd be a partnership. But that might pose a risk to the owners, because someone who sues an unlimited liability entity can reach not only the assets of the business, but also the personal assets of the owner, such as the bank account, the owner's cars, and their houses. So we acknowledge that oftentimes, many people just sort of go out and work. So Green Commonwealth could just, for financial reasons, for a number of reasons, they might just start work and go from there without forming a limited liability entity, and that's fine. And in those cases, they wouldn't have the limited liability protection, but they could also avoid the need to maintain certain corporate formalities, and they could avoid the need to pay whatever the minimum tax would be, so like $800. So one way that businesses could minimize liability, whether they're an unlimited liability entity or a limited liability entity, is through insurance. So insurance really just depends on the business. Most businesses would have general liability insurance to protect against anything that sort of happens in the course of business, like bodily injuries or property damage or something like that. And other types of insurance would depend on the type of business that you run. So if my business requires me to drive or requires someone to drive, then I'd need automobile insurance. Oftentimes you'll need workers' compensation insurance. So things like that, you just have to research depending on the type of business you want. Another thing about insurance is that insurance companies will often defend lawsuits for you. And so that's really useful because, it's an extra layer of protection, and they have a stake in making sure that your liability is limited. All right, so worker-owned business entities, right? That's what we're here for. I'd say, you could consider a limited liability entity like we discussed earlier. And the most commonly used limited liability entities for worker-owned businesses are the cooperative corporation and the limited liability company, the LLC. There are other entity types that we won't discuss today and that Eve alluded to earlier. So there's the traditional corporation, the domestic stock corporation like Apple. There's the flexible purpose corporation. There's the benefit corporation. There are a number of other business entity types. And so, as Eve mentioned before, Apple and companies like that give ownership and control to the investors, to the shareholders, and not to the workers necessarily. And the flexible purpose corporation and benefit corporation allow for embedding these social missions, certain social missions into the DNA of the organization. So that way these entities can maximize more than just the benefit of the shareholders, but maximize things that pertain to the community or the environment, and or the employees. So just going through the cooperative corporation and the LLC, some of the benefits of the LLC are that it's commonly used. The law is more settled in that area. So for instance, in terms of cooperative corporations, the IRS hasn't decided how they're going to treat the taxes of the patronage payouts. So the money that gets, the money that goes directly to the worker owners, the IRS hasn't figured out how they're going to tax it. And so that's a potential drawback for that, for worker cooperatives, for cooperative corporations rather. And the LLC is very flexible. They can determine how they're going to distribute profit in a number of ways, as opposed to the cooperative corporation. The statute only allows you to distribute profit and patronage payouts by the number of hours worked or the amount of wages earned. LLCs also have fewer formalities. So cooperative corporations require an annual general meeting, regular minutes, and having a board of directors. And I'll discuss more about a board of directors in the governance section, which is coming up. So it could be better for a small business to form as an LLC. So this is 2012, and the UN has declared this the International Year of Cooperatives. So glad you're all here. So cooperative corporations are based on this premise of worker ownership, and it's really embedded into how, it's embedded into the DNA of the corporation. So it's based on this ideal of one member, one vote. Another benefit of the cooperative corporation is that if you're doing any work that requires contractors' licenses, it's cheaper. The insurance is cheaper because for the LLC there are higher insurance and bond requirements. So the steps to formation are pretty similar for the cooperative corporation and the LLC. You want to check the business name. You want to check for the availability of it, because if I have a brilliant idea for a name of company and somebody else has already taken that name, I can't do it. So the name can't be the same, and it can't be confusingly similar to other business names. So what you might want to do, or what you would want to do, is to ensure that you don't infringe on other people's trademarks, other entities' trademarks. You can check with the California Secretary of State name registrars, and also check against the state and federal trademark registrars. So the Articles of Incorporation / the Articles of Organization are to be filed with the California Secretary of State, and it just contains basic information about the company. And then the bylaws, or the operating agreement, they set the rules for how the worker owners interact and how the business is managed, owned, operated, and governed. And these are really the heart of the business. The initial founders sit down and they decide the rules. So it's something that requires great care and great forethought. And in the manual, we've sort of translated a set of bylaws into more plain English, so that way that can help you think more about how to form these bylaws, this operating agreement, the rules and the premise of the business. So in terms of conversion, it's possible. So if you decide, I have an LLC, but I think I should have formed as a cooperative corporation, or vice versa, you can switch, and it only costs $150. You fill out a form, but there could be negative tax implications of converting. So if you own, for instance, a factory, and the factory appreciates, and then you want to convert, they'll treat it as a sale and a repurchase, and you might have to pay capital gains tax. So in order to avoid those issues, you might just want to really give thought at the beginning to which you want to form as and stick with it. So now what? We've talked about entity formation. Now Green Commonwealth would have to start thinking about governance. How do they want to structure the worker-owned business? Who's going to own the business? Who's going to manage the business? So on to governance. What is governance? It describes how the company is controlled. It describes how decisions are made. It describes who's accountable to whom. And these are all really important questions. In a cooperative, workers control the company. Workers make the key business decisions. It's democratically governed. And so there's a board of directors and there are officers. The board of directors is a group of individuals who serve as like the governing body of the cooperative. So in most cases, the worker members of a worker cooperative elect the board of directors. The board has legal responsibilities to be loyal to the company, to act with care and honesty, and to operate the company for the benefit of the membership. So if there are only a few workers, if it's a small worker cooperative, the board can be comprised of all of the worker members, and so that's referred to as a collective board. We just have to make sure, because the statute, the law mandates that you have a minimum of 3 people on the board of directors. So asking you guys a question, does anybody think they want to start a cooperative with fewer than 5 members? You raise your hand if you do. Okay, yeah, so in that case, like, you could consider being a collective board. So officers are the executive agents. They're the people who sort of run the day-to-day and manage the day-to-day part of the business. And there have to be 3, like the law requires there have to be 3. A president, at least 3 rather. A president, a secretary, and a treasurer. So for example, the president can be empowered to sign documents on behalf of the cooperative. Secretary could provide required notices to members and keep meeting minutes. And a financial officer, like a treasurer, would manage the finances and the accounts and sign checks on behalf of the corporation, the cooperative corporation. So workplace structure. There can be tremendous hierarchy, there can be minimal hierarchy, or there can be sort of a hybrid somewhere in between the two. And so for worker cooperatives, it would be most common for this sort of hybrid where there's some hierarchy, but there's still a good level of democracy retained within the business. So certain decisions in the bylaws can come from the top and just sort of be top-down decided, but then certain can be delegated to other people on the teams and like not necessarily come from only the president, for instance. Also, people can cycle through the board. So worker members can spend a certain amount of time on the board and then everybody can shift through it, or there can be a collective board. So there are a number of ways that you can keep an amount of democracy or like have a bit of hierarchy. So the fact that workers are owners doesn't compel them to adopt any one organizational model for the workplace. A business that's founded on democratic workplace principles should spend extra time figuring out how they want to incorporate this democracy in the workplace and how it's going to manifest itself. And also be aware that cooperatives can evolve as they grow in size and complexity. So when there are 5 members and maybe there's a collective board, that can sort of change a long time, because if there are, say, 25 members later on, that might become unmanageable. So flexibility is also important. So not all workers are necessarily members, and there are issues to consider with regard to who's going to be given membership and who might not be, like fluctuating labor needs and the dynamics of a democratic workplace. So there could be a membership probation period where the non-members don't necessarily share in the distribution of profits. Usually a worker co-op would take a vote. The members would take a vote and decide which non-members would be invited to join. Also thinking about the dynamics of the democratic workplace, members could sort of become like bosses to non-members, and that could create a tension between the two groups, like making the non-members feel like they're sort of second-class workers. And so that's not the purpose of the worker cooperative, so that's also something to consider. And transparency is also important, so that way non-members know about whatever the path to membership may or may not be. So, cooperative principles. We've talked about this a bit. We've talked about this idea of one member, one vote. But like, what does that mean? How does that play out? Do all decisions get made on a majority vote? Does it take 2/3? Does it take consensus? What if certain people can't come to the board meetings? Then how are absentees dealt with? Some decisions might require a higher approval level, so some might require consensus, some might require 2/3. What decisions can members or teams or supervisors make, and which can be appealed, if any? So paying attention to those questions, then the cooperative can decide how the company is going to monitor its social, its economic, and its environmental impact. So you might want to have governance controls. You want to hold directors accountable both to each other and to the board as a whole. You want to keep the board on task. And so you might want to do that through regular board elections, for instance. The default, if it's not mentioned in the bylaws, is that board elections happen yearly. But the maximum you can keep a board member in office for is 4 years. So one way to keep directors accountable is by sort of just monitoring them for attendance and participation and knowledge of issues that are affecting the business. If an individual director or officer acts according to his or her own interests as opposed to what's best for the cooperative, how does the board reclaim its own authority? That's an issue that needs to be addressed when considering things in the bylaws. Managers need to be directly accountable to the worker owners, inviting participation from workers prior to making a decision, explaining their decisions, and providing a means for review and evaluation by workers. So that way it's not like a unilateral top-down process. If there are loose structures or no structures of command and control, then leaders can arise spontaneously, which is good for the democracy in the workplace, but it could become unmanageable. So that's something to pay attention to. Because you don't want leaders to arise spontaneously and then not be accountable to the business. All right, so now we're going to move on. Because, you know, all of this stuff is nice, the governance is nice, the entity is nice, but we need to start thinking about the money, because that's the heart of the business. So I'm going to pass on to Kristen, and she's going to talk about the money.